excited to share my doctoral defense here and share a bit of my journey with you. As you can see here, my dissertation is entitled Serving Others, a Comparative Case Study of Volunteer Retention at 2 Child Advocacy Nonprofits. And as Dr. Martin, he is my dissertation chair, and Dr. Getterman is my second committee member. And they've been really great to work with. Not only have I really benefited from their academic knowledge, but they've always been so supportive of me. And if there are 2 more patient men on this planet, I don't know them. They've always answered all my questions and just been so great. I want to point out too that statistics really isn't my thing, but Dr. Getterman was really patient in explaining SPSS to me, and so I will never forget that. So thank you. Okay. So, whoops. I always find the most interesting part of the dissertation, or at least one of them, is knowing why the student chose the topic that they did. So this isn't just any awkward family photo, this is my awkward family. And I am the crabby baby in this picture. So shortly after this photo was taken, my parents decided to get involved in foster care. So during the course of my growing up, we had about 40 foster kids in our home, not at one time, but over the course of my growing up. And so really influenced me as a person. I think it made me a more compassionate person, a more patient person, though I still work with those things now. But it also influenced my academic and career choices. I've largely worked in nonprofits, advocating for kids who have been less fortunate. So naturally, that experience led me to CASA, which stands for Court Appointed Special Advocate. CASA is a nonprofit agency that empowers volunteers to give children volunteers to give children a voice in the court process. CASA is headquartered in Seattle, Washington, and then there's local programs throughout the country, all states except North Dakota, and no one's ever been able to explain to me why that is. This is a volunteer-driven organization. And like I said, volunteers are trained and empowered to give a voice to children in foster care. So I used my volunteer work because I was a volunteer at CASA, and I also worked at CASA for 4 years. And so that's how my interest in this study developed. So I want to introduce 3 key terms that I think might be useful in this presentation. The first is foster care, which is a temporary living situation for children who have been removed from their parents' care, and the state becomes the guardian of the child. When I worked at CASA for Douglas County, the most common reason for removal was neglect, and that was either due to substance abuse, unaddressed mental health issues, or domestic violence. And then permanency is when that a point at which the child has obtained a planned long-term living arrangement, either through adoption, reunification with the biological parents, or through guardianship. Retention for this study, there's a lot of various definitions floating around, but the one I chose is that the volunteer has been with an agency for at least 2 years. So it's interesting. I think CASA is one of the hardest volunteer positions out there. We do an extensive background, or CASA does an extensive background check. Volunteers are expected to go through 30 hours of training before they ever meet the child that they're going to advocate for. And they are appointed by a juvenile court judge. The volunteer is expected to meet with the child at least 1 time per month, and pre-COVID, we really wanted people to meet with their child at least face-to-face. It was very important to have that sort of interaction that you could really see the child, see where they lived in their environment. Sometimes kids will say that they have a bed, but they really don't. So it behooved the volunteers to see the children in their actual environment. The CASA volunteer typically volunteers for around 8 to 12 hours per month. And they collaborate with other members of the interdisciplinary team. So they're working with the caseworker, who is typically a social worker, other attorneys. So the parents each have their own attorneys, plus the child has an attorney called the guardian ad litem. And then they take that information that they've compiled from all those different people, and they write a court report that's submitted to the juvenile court at the juvenile judge at court. The goal for the CASA is to get their recommendations adopted and placed into the court report so that the child can receive the services that they need. So volunteer retention is absolutely critical. The United States is highly reliant on volunteers to get things done. As you maybe have noticed, there's the get out the vote, civic engagement kind of things, the census workers, a lot of them are volunteers, food distribution, and then child welfare is reliant upon volunteers as well. The challenges, though, with CASA is that many people prefer to volunteer as short episodic stints. So maybe serving food at a food bank or working on a house for Habitat for Humanity. And those are quick things. CASA is not a quick thing. You know, we're asking for a huge time commitment, not only with training, but the 8 to 12 hours per month, plus 12 hours per year of continuing education. It's a lot of time. Recruiting and training volunteers is pretty expensive too, and the first 6 months are generally the most expensive. So if we have a volunteer and we've trained them and then they leave the organization, not only is that expensive to the organization, but it creates another trauma for the child because they have another adult who's again then left them. So that's why I think this study is kind of important. The purpose of the study is that it's a qualitative comparative case study going to explore the motivations of long-term advocates, so who have had a 2-year experience with CASA programs A and B, and how those motivations influence the decision to remain in the organization. So I called them CASA programs A and B. I talked with Dr. Martin and Dr. Guterman about this, and we all thought it might be a good idea to keep these sites anonymous so I would be able to speak freely about their strengths and any weaknesses that I may uncover. The research question was, how do long-term volunteers describe the reasons they continue service at CASA programs A and B? And then the sub-question was, how do long-term volunteers perceive the organizational support from CASA programs A and B? The aim of the study was to develop a comprehensive list of recommendations with the goal of retaining volunteers. And these recommendations will inform recruiting, training, and advocate supervisor practices. So advocate supervisors are the paid employees of the CASA organization, and they coach volunteers about how to do their advocacy work. So literature review, I broke that into 3 sections: motivation, organizational factors, and Eleanor Ostrom's institutional analysis and development framework. Okay, so intrinsic motivation is defined as wanting to do an activity just merely for the joy of it. Human beings are hardwired for play and creativity, and I think a lot of us adults tend to forget that. Warm glow is the feeling a person gets when they donate money or volunteer their time, particularly when it's hard to do so. Helper's high is a feeling of joy and enthusiasm. It's associated with increased levels of vasopressin and oxytocin, those feel-good neuropeptides. I also want to touch on the psychological contract, and those are the rules and expectations, both implicit and explicit, between organizations and volunteers. In the past, this has been studied in the for-profit setting, but it turns out that it's getting quite a bit of attention in the nonprofit world, and I think that's great. And it's important. Volunteers get an idea of what they're getting into through the training process, and organizations can set goals. And if these things align, both parties can be satisfied, and that can possibly lead to increased retention. Extrinsic motivation is when an individual does an activity to receive something in return. So for a job, that would be getting a paycheck, hopefully receiving healthcare benefits. But in the case of volunteers, the motivation will maybe be, oh, this could look good on my resume or help me get into law school. Extrinsic motivation isn't necessarily bad, it's just different. Generally speaking, though, volunteers tend to stay in organizations longer when they are intrinsically motivated. But that's not to say that someone who starts out extrinsically motivated, that motivation can't change over time. For example, the pre-law student who gets accepted into law school can say, wow, this really did help me get into law school, but now I'm really liking it. So I think I'm just going to stay anyway. So that's a look at that. A somewhat new way to look at volunteer retention is through organizational factors. And largely been studied in the for-profit world, but I'm really fascinated that's starting to be kind of addressed in the nonprofit setting. So not surprisingly, the more competent an organization, the more satisfied the employees tend to be, or the volunteer. Following along those lines, the more the organization communicates and the more transparent that communication is, the happier that the volunteer tends to be. Volunteers highly prize organizational support, but only to the extent that it helps them work autonomously and creatively. People do like organizational support, but they don't want the handholding. They want to be able to do things on their own, which I thought was really kind of interesting. So a lot of organizational factors here. So thanks to Dr. Martin, he introduced me to Dr. Ostrom, and who's no longer with us, and intellectually introduced me to her, I should say. So this is her framework. I'm going to call it the IAD framework going forward, and this framework was used to guide the inquiry, so my study, in an exploratory and deductive way. A deductive process begins with a general premise. For example, motivation influences volunteer retention, leading to specific conclusions. For example, volunteer retention may be influenced by the intrinsic motivation of altruism. The framework is used to explain and predict behavior in an organization. For the purposes of this study, I'm going to focus on the two leftmost pieces of the framework. So the action arena is the action situations, the decision of whether to remain or leave the organization, and the participants are the volunteers. So to the left of that action arena are the exogenous variables, which is just a fancy term for outside influences. So those influences really affect the decision to stay or leave, but these are things that the volunteer has little to no control over. So the biophysical material conditions would be those things in the office, like the furniture, the manuals, the computer programming that they use. So those kinds of things. The attributes of the community are the characteristics of the community, the CASA volunteer community. So largely the volunteers with whom I spoke were women who worked full-time, who had been with the organization anywhere between 2 and 15 years. There are also the rules, the do's and don'ts of the organization, and we're going to go into a little more detail about that later. And Dr. Martin made this framework, so thanks for that, because I'm not all that skilled in computer stuff. I want to talk to you a little bit about the methodology, and he led on in the beginning, which is very true. This study has taken on many iterations, and I have to say, I really wanted to do a mixed method study in the beginning because I thought it was harder, and I thought I'd be smarter if I did it that way. And I think he said, or someone did, if you like research so much, you can do another study. So it's funny how that worked out, because I actually am doing another study with Dr. Bloomquist that is mixed method studies, and not just because it's harder, but it makes sense for that particular study. So I settled on a qualitative comparative case study, and I didn't want to do a comparative case study because I was terrified it was going to be a lot of work. And it wasn't bad, but I think Dr. Martin maybe thought I was being belligerent by not wanting to do that, but it was only because I was scared it was going to be a lot of work. But life circumstances changed it, so I was able to complete those interviews fairly easily, actually. I studied 2 CASA programs in the Midwest, and my participant characteristics, you have to be at least 21 years old to be at CASA, so, and been with CASA at least 2 years, because that was my definition of retention. You had to be in good standing with the organization, and you had to be carrying a case, so at least one child. I used a interview protocol, 15 questions, semi-structured interview, and I also used the Maslow Burnout Inventory Health Services Survey, and those were really great at generating a good deal of data. I had previously volunteered at one of the CASA programs that is part of the study, and I also worked at CASA for Douglas County. So I had to really work on my preconceived notions of what may have evolved during the interview process. And there were actually a couple times that I wanted to insert my own, well, I think you should do this. But it was really, I had to wear my researcher hat, and it was hard to not be, I wouldn't say bossy, but I wanted to share my ideas, and that just wasn't the place. So that was really hard for me as a researcher. I want to share with you at this time my results, and I split my results into 4 categories. So the first is themes, because I did a qualitative case study. The results from the Maslach burnout inventory, and I'll just call that the MBI from now on, and also the IAD analysis, and then we'll talk about my comparative case study. So the first theme that I uncovered was volunteers being seen and understood. And you know, not surprisingly, people like to be noticed for what makes them unique, and they like to be noticed for the contributions that they're making. So the quote I had here, it was so sweet. The volunteer was just so moved by being noticed by the executive director. And I think when we take time and notice people, I think that makes a difference in a multitude of ways that we might not even always know how it might play out. The second theme is volunteers' difficulties with caseworkers and other case professionals. The court process is inherently antagonistic. Although family court, which is where these cases are held, is supposed to be rehabilitative, I think people have different ideas of what best interest of the child means. Even though we're all on the same side, it feels like sometimes we're not. So this is a quote from a volunteer that kind of illustrated what a lot of other volunteers were feeling, is that they want quicker response times from the people that they're working with on cases. For theme number 3, I looked at the motivations to serve at CASA, and this quote really displays what the judges call CASA, the eyes and ears of the court. Interesting and sadly to me, a lot of the judges who are making decisions about the safety, well-being, and permanency of children often don't meet them. And so the onus is on the volunteer to provide a picture, quite literally and figuratively. So pictures of the child, plus the report that they write really kind of lifts that child off the page, and so that the judge can understand who they are making decisions for. Theme number 4 is volunteer reflections on organizational support. And, you know, spoiler alert, both CASA programs have done a really exceptional job with the organizational support and making sure that the volunteers feel very supportive in their role as a CASA volunteer. Just give me 1 second here, sorry. I want to talk a bit about the Maslach burnout inventory. So for all of the participants I had in the study, they all completed this the survey, and the survey assesses burnout for people who are working or volunteering in human services conditions. So there is a correlation between people who work and volunteer in these industries and burnout. So Maslach and her coworkers developed 3 scales to look at burnout for this, and emotional exhaustion and depersonalization, as well as personal accomplishment. So I think we all can identify with emotional exhaustion, just feeling bone tired, just really exhausted. Depersonalization is kind of seeing the people that you're serving, perhaps your clients, more as objects than as human beings. And then people need to feel like they're accomplishing something. Most often in any role, but I think this is particularly important in the human services industry. What I found, though, the MBI does not have cutoff scores for burnout. So like if you achieve a score of 30, you're burnout. They found that the authors of this survey found that to be problematic. According to the manual, the means and standard deviations can be calculated for a group and then compared to the normative data. But with an N as low as 19, which that's how many participants I had, it would not be advised. That being said, you can see that there's a slight difference. Emotional exhaustion is slightly elevated in CASA Program A and in personal accomplishment, but those differences were not statistically significant, so we can't really make any generalizations based on that. When it comes to the IAD findings, I told you at one point that we would talk about the rules, so here we are. We're going to talk about rules in more depth. Um, so a rule in use is a rule that has consequences for either doing the thing or not doing the thing. For example, if an individual doesn't shovel their sidewalk outside their home 24 hours after a snowfall, a fine is incurred from the city. A norm is a rule that's obligatory, but there's no punishment if you don't do it. For example, when a car pulls up behind you in the fast lane, you should move over into the slow lane. But, you're not going to get arrested if you don't. Lastly, there are shared strategies, which are not obligatory, but rather a good idea. For example, when someone sends you a gift, you should send a thank you card. Let me show you what this means for this study. So for shared strategies, I found two that I want to share with you today. And one of them, that staff members can honor volunteers by asking the volunteer to do more work. Now this is a little counterintuitive. Like you think, well, they're already working for free. Asking them to do more work, that seems insane. But actually, if you go back to theme 1 and noticing volunteers for their unique skills that they bring to the table, that can be actually really kind of complementary. So let's say you have a teacher who is an advocate, and maybe that teacher can give a presentation on the importance of 504 plans or an IEP plan for volunteers who have kids with those documentations in the school system. So not only does that volunteer get noticed for their special skills, but they can share that specialized information that's going to help a lot of people. Secondly, the other shared strategy is CASA volunteers would like to see return communication from caseworkers and other case professionals within 24 to 48 business hours. Now, this is not currently in use, but I think it would really help on both sides. I think CASA volunteers would like to be kept more in the loop, and the caseworkers would like to not be hearing from CASA volunteers all the time. Where's my information? Where's my information? When it comes to rules, one of the biggest rules is all volunteers must undergo 30 hours of pre-service training. Now that sounds like a lot, and it is, but it's during this time that, I should mention that if they don't do the 30 hours of training, they can't be a volunteer. So that's the consequence, I guess. But the 30 hours of training are a great time for the organization to, set their expectations and then follow through on those expectations. So if they tell the volunteer that, this is really hard, but we're going to support you all along the way, then that sets the expectation for the volunteer that A, it's going to be hard, but B, that's going to, they'll receive help from the organization, from staff members. Secondly, state law addresses the rights and responsibilities of CASA volunteers. It very explicitly states in Nebraska state law anyway, that volunteers need to make recommendations as to where the child should live. Now, this can be difficult to make a recommendation if they don't get timely information from the other case professionals. Some of the information the volunteer can get on their own, but sometimes they do rely on the caseworker and the guardian ad litem to get that additional information. However, if that information is not shared, they're not able to make recommendations, it's problematic. Further, it's problematic because the CASA organization, in order to enforce these rules, they have to hire an attorney, which is expensive for a nonprofit organization. And also, it can extend the time that the child is in out-of-home care. And we always want to get the child home or in a permanent setting as soon as possible. So, like I said, this was a comparative case study. And there weren't too many differences between the two CASA programs. Now, you will see that there's a huge discrepancy in retention, but that's due to their definition of what retention is. CASA Program A defines retention as taking a second case. Now, I think I mentioned before that an average CASA case lasts about 2 years, but there are some cases I've seen go as long as 10 years. So, for example, a CASA volunteer who was on a case for 5 years and doesn't take another case would not be considered retained by CASA Program A. On the other hand, CASA Program B uses the same definition I used for this study, which was a 2-year commitment. So those numbers are wildly different, yes, but I think it's it's an apple and oranges kind of thing. We're looking at two different numbers. When I look, another difference too is during the study, CASA Program B was going under a significant overhaul in case management. It was privately contracted, still is, and they were in the process of switching organizations at the time. So it led to a lot of turnover in terms of caseworkers. Their phones didn't work for weeks at a time. So a lot of things fell through the cracks at that time, and it was really unfortunate. Now, at CASA Program A, the caseworkers are state employees. So that change wasn't happening during that time, but I have consistency in quotes because there is significant turnover no matter what in case management, and they still have the same problems of not returning, phone calls of CASA volunteers or emails and things like that. So the other difference that I saw for CASA Program B, I thought since their CASA offices are located inside the courthouse that they would have better relationships with other case professionals, but that wasn't the case. They just had problematic relationships just like CASA Program A. So my summary of findings at this point are that participants are largely motivated intrinsically. Participants from both programs feel really supported by the leadership and the staff members. Volunteers want to be recognized for their own unique skills. Two things that I found interesting. So there's a minimal number of rules, those rules in use that I talked about earlier, describing what a CASA volunteer has to do as a volunteer. You're largely able to be pretty creative in what you want to do. I mean, there are the rules like you need to see your kid once a month, blah, 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 blah. But they're allowed that freedom, and adults really do want not to, most adults, I guess, would not want to be micromanaged. So that's I think that was really important. The other thing is that there's a lot of rules regarding the relationship a CASA volunteer has with their CASA child, meaning that they're not supposed to take their CASA to their home, not supposed to meet their family members, not post the child's picture on social media. And I think those boundaries are great for a lot of reasons. I think it keeps the volunteer more invested in the mission than as the child. Now, I want them involved in the child, but I think it makes more sense to have them be more of an advocate than a buddy. The kid probably does not need a buddy. They need someone who's going to advocate for their best interest and get the services they need through the court system. So after all, this is leadership program, so I probably should talk about that. Participants from the study, they reported elements of transformational, authentic, and servant leadership in their supervisors, So one of my professors too, Dr. Kuntz, he edited a book about followership, and in this book, one of the contributors mentioned the mission statement, being an invisible leader. And I really find this to be very true for CASA, because being the voice of a child is, something all the volunteers mentioned, and I think it leads them in their advocacy. I think it's very important. And intrinsic motivation is a strong driver for the volunteers that I talk to. So when it comes to recommendations, I would say that the leadership at both CASA programs and their staff have gotten to know their volunteers, and I think we could always be learning more about people. You never know what you might learn about somebody and how they can, turn that around and learn more about the system or how to advocate for kids. I would also recommend that the CASA programs reimburse volunteers for out-of-pocket expenses. Some of the volunteers that I spoke to drive significant distances to see their CASA kid. And while the organization is very willing to do that, I think some of the volunteers feel shy about asking for that reimbursement. So if that recommendation that the staff could ask the volunteers to, hey, I see you've been driving a lot, you want to be reimbursed. I think that it should come from the leadership at the CASA organization. Also, I would recommend to ask your volunteers to do more work when appropriate, and make sure you give them an out too, because you may think that they're willing and they may feel like they have to do it. So always give them an out. Hey, I know you're busy, but hey, would you mind doing this? And I think it's absolutely critical that in relationships with caseworkers and other case professionals improve. that really needs really immediate attention. So for future research, I always suggest studying the link between volunteer retention and organizational practices. I think we're just now starting to make headway, and I think there could be a lot of really good research done that way. I would also recommend that we look, as scholars, look at the psychological contract between agency and volunteer. Determine how to attract super volunteers. So super volunteers are those who volunteer more than 10 hours a week. And they work in these kinds of industries such as child welfare that have high burnout rates. So what I was reading, these kind of are amazing people. From a management standpoint, you are inputting a little bit extra work, with talking over, debriefing with them, but the payout is so good from the quality of work that you get from these volunteers. So I think it would be really important to look at how we can attract these kind of volunteers. And lastly, I'd like to look at warm glow and how that relates to intrinsic motivation that leads individuals to volunteer. In summary, volunteers are seeking opportunities where they can make a meaningful contribution, be recognized for their uniqueness, be creative and autonomous, where they can work hard and be really supported by the organization. And organizational leaders can provide this by seeing their volunteers, providing really strong infrastructure, and linking the volunteers' work to the mission. I've reached the end of my presentation, and I would like to acknowledge some folks here. The core faculty and staff have been phenomenal. It's been an amazing 4 years, most of it pretty great. And actually the staff too, Lydia and Shannon and Monica, have really made my process as a student really fantastic. I also want to thank my colleagues in the EDD program who've challenged me, who've supported me along the way. I also want to thank CASA programs A and B, their leadership and their volunteers who were so willing to give their time, and my family and friends, and specifically the family who's here today because they are my favorites. Don't tell. Thank you, and I want to turn it back over to Dr. Martin at this point.
Thank you, Sarah. Great job. And so, as mentioned, at this point, Dr. Guterman and I will ask a few questions. And I'll start with one. I've got a couple. So and you spoke to this a little bit, but can you, and this may be a benefit to some of the students who are coming up through the process, is that, can you speak to how you kept that work knowledge separate from your efforts in your dissertation research? We had several conversations about it, and so I think that might be helpful to get a little perspective on.
Yes. When I first started out, I was working at CASA for Douglas County, and I just thought, oh, it's going to be so easy if I just, do my study there. And that turned out to be not a great idea because for a lot of reasons, because I'm kind of a fixer. So if a volunteer tells me that they're having a problem, I want to go ahead and fix it. And that separating the researcher in me versus the employee of me, that would have been really too challenging to do. I think, though, having the knowledge of working and volunteering at CASA was of great benefit to me. I think I was able to relate to the participants in the study very well. I spoke the same language. I knew what they were talking about when they were talking about their struggles or things that were hard. I could empathize with them, with the trauma that they've heard from their kiddos. So I think largely my knowledge was a benefit, but I really had to separate myself as the volunteer, as a former employee versus a researcher, and that was interesting.
Yeah, and just for the benefit of those attending, so Sarah talked to me about that, and to Dr. Guterman on a few occasions of things that came up that she was like, I don't know which hat I'm supposed to wear right here in this spot, and I think those were useful conversations to have. My second question would be, so you use the framework, and then reflecting on your use of it, what do you think? Good choice for you to do that? You know, how did it work? How did it inform or constrain you?
It didn't constrain me, and I want to go back to it here. I think it made my study a lot more rich. I think it gave me something to wrap my head around, that it gave me a framework to use to better understand my results. Now, I will say in the beginning, I had a hard time really understanding it. And about a year into the process, I was still asking very basic questions like, what does this mean? But once I finally grasped it, I think it really made for a more interesting, more rich study. And now I'm starting to see this kind of, this framework apply in different situations. And really, it's everywhere. And yeah, I also want to point out too that Dr. Sue Crawford collaborated with Dr. Ostrom, and Dr. Crawford is a professor in political science here at Creighton, and she's also a state legislator in Sarpy County. And so it's really nice to be able to walk in the footsteps of these women and carry this information and data forward.
Thank you. Yeah. So Tim, how about, you got any questions?
Yeah, just a few, thank you. So first, I guess I was hoping that you might expand a little bit on your usage of the framework. And I guess what I'm wondering is, you know, where did that come into your research? Did it inform analysis? In what ways? Or did you sort of, you know, conduct all of your analysis and then think about the framework later? So if you could walk us through how that happened, I think that would be a good clarification.
Sure. So I suppose I started, you know, the work on this study a few years ago, and kind of doing my base work throughout the coursework and learning more about volunteer retention as I went along. And it wasn't until, when was that trust workshop? So that's when Dr. Martin and I kind of talked about the framework and how I could use that in my study. I didn't really apply it. I mean, I talked about it in the study, obviously, you know, in chapters 1 and 2, but I didn't really apply it until after I found my findings. So after I found the themes, and then I applied it to those. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It makes perfect sense. You kind of followed more of the process of, at least, you know, for qualitative inquiry, you saw what was in the data and then sort of came in with a framework after that. So yeah, no, that makes sense. Thanks for clarifying that. I think that's important. Just as a minor comment, I found the finding around the proximity to be really quite interesting, and I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on it. The co-location of CASA and the courts, I guess.
I think that's a great question, because that was really surprising to me. But I found that I think the other case professionals just don't value CASA. I think partly because they're unpaid, partly because perhaps they have a reputation of being nosy and busybodies. And so they can slow down the closure of cases, which in turn costs the state more money, right? So I think they want to keep CASA out of some of those conversations. And in my dissertation, I talk a little bit more. There's these conversations that happen right outside the courtroom. Sometimes the judge is present, and sometimes the judge is there. And they'll have the case professionals there, but they won't let CASA know that they're talking. So they're talking about really important things, and it's CASA, the volunteer, usually who has been the last person to see that child, and they're not being able to weigh in on these issues. I think largely because they have the most information, and it can slow things down. So yeah, that was very frustrating to hear, and that happened to Douglas County too. So I wasn't surprised to hear it, I guess.
Yeah, no, a little more universal. It's interesting though. And I guess just as a final question, so let's say someone came to you from another county. I'm spacing another county in Nebraska, Hall County, I think. And they said, you know, we want your recommendations. What are the top 3 things you would do with our CASA program, and particularly the people, the volunteers? What would you recommend?
I would recommend really good, building good relationships with the other case professionals. I really think working as a team that we're all on the same page of what the best interest of the child is. And sometimes that can look a little different, but I think just even having collegial relationships would go a long way. I think people like snacks and eating over, like when you share a meal with someone, that makes a huge difference. And it doesn't have to be anything expensive or fancy, like, I don't know, anything. So break bread. That would be my first suggestion. My second suggestion is something that we did at CASA for Douglas County. And one of the things really I'm kind of most proud of is that we created a volunteer advisory committee. So we took volunteers and tried to make it as diverse as we could with respect to how long they'd been with the organization. We wanted people of color, we wanted men. And gave those volunteers a voice of what they could see how to improve the organization. So that would be my second recommendation. The third, ask volunteers to do more work because I think they want to. I really do. Like the volunteers who I spoke with, and they just like being recognized for their special skills. Now, that may be my own bias because I like it when people ask me to do work, but I really think I saw that in those volunteers with whom I spoke.
Great. Thank you for those additions. That's all my questions. Back to you, Jim.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. One thing I wanted to ask, so you no longer work for CASA.
That's correct.
And so what's next for you? What's on your radar for your next efforts?
I don't know. I really like this class, and I'm teaching with Dr. Bloomquist right now. So I'm teaching meditation, mindfulness, and yoga in the medical school. I love the medical humanities, and I think they're fascinating. And like I mentioned before, we're also conducting a research study in addition to that class that we're teaching. And so that there's 3 more instances where that class will be held. I don't know. I'm kind of playing around with a couple ideas right now, but nothing really set in stone. So, yeah.
Okay. So at this point, I just open it up for any questions from the audience. And I think perhaps a way to do this would be to use the little reactions button and just raise your hand if you've got a question. Or you can unmute and just start blurting it out. Anybody?
No questions.
Oh, there we go. Andrea has a question.
Awesome.
Hey, Sarah, can you hear me well? I just changed my microphone.
Yes, I can hear you just fine. Thank you.
Congratulations again. I need to go into minutes, so please excuse me. But this is my question. We both serve as volunteers for Alpha Iota Sigma now.
Yes.
I was thinking about the application of your study about volunteers in Alpha Iota Sigma. So the question is, how would the results of this research could apply for the work we're doing? And if maybe, do you see any room in the future for an application there? Thank you.
Wow, that is an excellent question. I think we're already kind of doing it now. Like, you're on the research and networking committee. I think that is where your particular skill set really lies, like in the research and those kind of things. So I think seeking out people for what they're really good at, like Pamela on the affinity and working on the Blessed Community project, I think that's great. I think we're doing it. And I think, my recommendation of asking people to do more work, I think we need to be very careful of that for this particular, for our honor society, because people are put in so many different directions, with family, with school, and all these things. So make sure that when we do ask people to do extra work, that we do give them an out, because not everybody is all, I'll do it, like me. So, yes. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Looks like a few people turned on their cameras. I don't know if that means they have questions or
they're just being friendly.
Okay.
I have a question, Sarah.
Hi, Ben.
Hello. Concerning the framework, did you within a volunteer setting, and then specifically with CASA, was there a primacy where the interplay of rules and norms were norms viewed as the main driving force as one entered into an action arena, or was it the rules? Did you view them as equals? Kind of what were the values of the individuals you included in your research?
That's a really good question. And, I didn't find that many norms in the study, looking really hard. More shared strategies and rules in use. So the rules in use really guided the relationship between the CASA volunteer and the CASA child. So a lot of rules around that, like if you take the kid home with you, and even if nothing untoward happens, you can be fired for that. So that was a pretty strict rule. The shared strategies, that kind of more guided how to be a volunteer. It's a good idea if you meet with the child's teachers, with their therapist, with their physician, but there weren't any rules saying if you don't do this, you're fired. So I think the rules did generally guide a lot of the behavior with the volunteer and the child, but the shared strategies really governed the experience between the volunteer and the CASA staff. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Sarah. It's
Hello.
Dr. MBK. Hi, how are you?
How are you doing today?
I am doing well. Thank you. That was a great presentation, and I love so much about your work. I love the definitions of the motivations why people volunteer. I thought that was super interesting because that added depth to my knowledge about, I forget the actual names, but they were very clever names. I don't know if you made those up or if those were in the literature, but I've led volunteers in ministry in a previous life, and one thing I learned through that experience was that they're there for a reason. Their reasons can vary, but they are maybe equally and more dedicated to what the work is than perhaps the staff are at times, and it can create and so it's such a delicate thing to manage when you're leading volunteers. So my question to you, based upon what you've learned, is this work, it's a qualitative study. It's very case bound in your case. But can you take nuggets and pull this into other volunteer settings? And if so, how might you do that?
I think so. It was I think CASA is, as I mentioned, a very unique volunteer experience because of the time required by the people participating, as well as the emotional hardness of all of it. But I do think, getting to know volunteers, employing that charism of cura personalis, when would that ever be bad? I think we should be doing that in the work setting and any volunteer setting. I think the more you know about a person, the best that you can utilize their skills in the most, beneficial way to the person volunteering and to the organization. So I think that would be fantastic. So, and I think some of the others, I think a volunteer advisory board would also be great too in any organization. I think the volunteers should have a voice in how things are run in the organization. Now, again, you run the risk of, are the volunteers running this show, and how do you develop those policies that they don't run the show, and that they don't need to know all of the organizational goings on, right? So, but if you know that going into it, you can set up those policies up ahead of time.
Yeah, I can see if you're working with a child one-on-one and they have so much responsibility with making decisions on behalf of the child, it sounds like, being an advocate, that could be really, really tough, as you already know. So the policies would probably be very helpful. But anyway, I thank you for your answer, and I'll let someone else ask a question. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
Looked like Jessica had a question.
Hi, great job, Sarah. It's very, very interesting research. I think one of the things that stood out to me as someone who's worked as a volunteer and volunteer management over the years was volunteers want to be seen. And I was curious because you hear that concept a lot in psychology or interpersonal relationships, therapy, counseling, but I've not heard that in volunteerism to that same extent or in that way. Was that reflected in the literature that you saw, or is that something that might have, and I say this in a good way, but like crept over from sort of interpersonal and psychology into the literature of volunteer management?
You know, it was a little bit in the literature, and please don't ask me who it was because I can't remember right now. But I think probably in my own experience too, when I worked at CASA, I was both a volunteer supervisor and then I was also a training coordinator. So I got to see the organization from a lot of different vantage points. But I knew from, well, I guess maybe this was part of my own experience as a volunteer advocate, just knowing that the more I invested learning about my volunteers, the more I got back from them, you know, like they could tell that I really cared, and I really did care, you know, and I often ask my volunteers to do more work. But I found that it just paid off in spades. And you know, it was true for these volunteers I spoke with as well. One of them was, in addition to being a CASA volunteer, she was also on the board, and she was just really grateful to have both opportunities. I think each informed the other of that role. So it made her a well-rounded volunteer. Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, Lee. Oh, you need to unmute, Lee.
I thought I did. Oh, hi there. Sarah, my friend. I'm very struck by this idea that it's actually offering volunteers more opportunity to do more.
Yeah.
And yet you also talked about burnout. And I'm always mindful how Dr. Bloomquist in particular always gave me new words to help me better understand concepts. And so, for example, she shifted me from talking about cultural competency to talking about cultural humility. And I'm just wondering, what do you think that it may not be burnout, but we talk a lot right now in the caring professions about compassion fatigue. And I'm just wondering, with the work that volunteers are doing in CASA, if it might not be so much burnout, especially given your findings related to doing more as opposed to compassion fatigue. Any thoughts about that?
Wow. Yeah, I could talk all day about that. The things that well, I have two different perspectives too, as being a volunteer and as being a someone who works there. So it was really challenging for me as someone who works there. There was quite a bit of compassion fatigue. I'm not going to share with you any specific stories because I don't want to put those images in your head, but the things that I would hear were very difficult for me. And I wasn't witnessing it at firsthand. You know, this is what the volunteers are telling me. And it was really hard. And I'm sure that they are, because the volunteers are more invested in each child that they have. I only heard about it secondhand, right, as a staff member. But yeah, that was a huge struggle. They're hearing terrible things day in and day out, and that does weigh on a person. So I think you're onto something with that compassion fatigue versus burnout. Yeah. And I do want to share too, in my when I was doing the interviews. So I had been out of CASA, not working there for about 6 months when I started working on those interviews. And I started hearing these stories again. And it was challenging, you know, and it made me really appreciate those volunteers who are in it day in and day out. And the staff members too are constantly doing this work. And hats off to them. You know, it's really hard work. And I'm so appreciative that there are people who are doing this work. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question. One of the things that you talked about with regard to the time commitment when you're looking at CASA volunteers, which is pretty extensive, and looking at the comparative of a lot of volunteer, and I've done a lot of volunteer work over the years with regard to it's this project or this project versus kind of the training and all the things that being a CASA volunteer encompasses. Was there anything, did you find in the metrics with regard to recruiting volunteers that would lead someone to believe that they really could make the type of commitment that they said they were going to make, which obviously then impacts the cost of the training and all those kinds of things? Sure. Is there any metric out there? Maybe there isn't. Can you stipulate who might be a one and done project person, if you will, volunteer, or kind of this more all encompassing that CASA would require?
So that's a really great question, and thanks for asking that. I think it goes back to that psychological contract that we talked about. So it's really the organization needs to be transparent in what they're expecting these volunteers to do, right? And so telling them, you know, it's going to be 30 hours of training. We have to do extensive background check, and you're expected to work about 8 to 12 hours per month. But we're going to support you. I think there are some volunteers, even though you tell them that, they don't really know what they're getting into until they're in it. Okay. So, I mean, you understand that too with hiring people, and you tell them all the things, but they don't necessarily get it. And the only thing that I can offer is that you got to be as transparent as possible, both as, you know, as a volunteer, knowing what your skills are and what your time availability is, and the organization needs to be transparent too, because you can say, well, it's probably about 4 hours a month, and then when they're asked to do so much more, they're like, this isn't what I was promised, and you're not supporting me in the way that I thought I was going to be. So I don't know of any metrics out there specifically addressing that, but that would be my take on it.
Great job. You did a great job today.
Thank you.
I'm glad to have you back in my life instead of you at Creighton all the time.
Yes.
Sarah Vandekamp.
Yeah, I just had a quick question about if you think that there will be an opportunity for you to present maybe some of the ideas that you have to CASA or to even any sort of volunteer organization so that they can benefit from your research.
Yeah, I am going to reach out to the executive directors. I know that they wanted to know what the findings were from my study and wanted to read it, but do they really want to read 150 pages? Methinks not. But I will give them the executive summary. So yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing it with them because I feel like they were so generous with their time and all of the sharing of data and getting me participants that I really want to pay it forward. So, and as for other organizations, yeah, I was in this book club at Creighton, and there was a woman there that suggested I should reach out to United Way. So we'll see.
Cool.
Thank you.
And then Lori Kay had a question.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
I find this very interesting. I'm wondering if you could tell me a little what characteristics you looked for to find two groups to compare to two of the different organizations and why you chose them over all the other ones.
Well, they were, oh, I know why. Because they were programs who were known to me. Can I say that, Dr. Martin? Yeah. Fine, I already did. So I did want to maintain some kind of confidentiality, but I picked them because they were similar in some respects in terms of size and their location. One's slightly bigger than the other, but they were comprised of kind of a similar demographic, I suppose. So yeah, those were the reasons that I picked those two particular programs.
Thank you.
Yes.
Any last questions? All right. Well, thank you. Let's all congratulate Sarah on a great job.
Thank you very much.
And it was great to have everybody here. Really proud of our program and our students, and really excited to have folks come to our defenses. So at this point, I'll ask everybody to log off. Dr. Guterman and I will confer for a moment, and then I will email Sarah and she will log back in a short bit.
All right. Thanks everybody for being here. It means the world to me.